right, continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to welcome back Robert S. Davis. Robert has more than 1,000 publications dealing with genealogy, history, records, and research, most of which deal with the state of Georgia in some form or another. He has been widely quoted or appeared in CNN, Times, Smithsonian, Newsweek, The Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. His work has received awards from the American Association for State and Local History, the Sons of the American Revolution, and the National Genealogical Society. He is a graduate of Piedmont College, North Georgia State College and University, and the University of Alabama in Birmingham. The TMCC Library has 8 of his books, which are available for checkout. Now retired, Robert continues on his important work in the field of genealogy. The title of today's presentation is Gone for a Soldier, Military Records of Georgia and the Old Southwest, 1783 to 1861. So I would like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Robert.
Thank you. Here we go. All right. First off, let me say that the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans are also very fine organizations. And they gladly accept African Americans and all people who descend from Confederate service. Also, indigenous Native people frequently served with the United States military, and the records that we'll be talking about today also apply to, as I say, Indians or Native American people who served with the U.S. military during these campaigns. Now, much of what I'm going to talk about today applies to the entire country, not just to the South, because the military records are pretty much uniform, and the ways of accessing these records and the wonderful information you can find from these records is fairly common. Now, just the other day, I was looking at a new email that's sent out every week on genealogy. Now, if you're like me, you've got several of these that you've signed up for. They're free, they're helpful. They contain all sorts of wonderful tips and information on genealogy. This one is from a man named Mark, M-A-R-C, and it's called Genealogy Explained. And I've got the website on the handout that's called Overall Points for Military Records Research. Anyway, he did a segment on military records. He did it by war, and it was a very good presentation, except he did not cover the overall rules about military records that you should know, even more than specific wars and campaigns. Now, the first thing to know about that, and this is explained in that overview of military records, is that most people think military records are good for determining, say, which side your ancestors served in during the Civil War. What was your ancestors' experience in World War II or the Vietnam, perhaps? Can you join the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons and Daughters of the War of 1812? Can you prove that service? Can you prove that service? But actually, military records are much, much more valuable than that. I used to have a friend, Gail Peters. He was director of the National Archives at Atlanta. And he would give those wonderful talks on federal records and how to use them in genealogy. But when it came to military records, my good friend was so wrong. He would say that military records are the croutons of genealogy. They're like croutons on a salad bar. You don't really care for them that much, but you'd miss them if they weren't there. Well, that's not true. Military records are wonderful. Now, part of the problem with military records is that most Americans, even most male Americans, never serve in the military. But of those who do, they generate a lot of paperwork. And much of that paperwork can help you in filling out your family tree. Napoleon used to say that an army marches on its stomach, an American army marches on its paperwork. You may remember who the most important person was in the 407 7th MASH unit on MASH. It was not Colonel Potter or the surgeons or any of that. It was Radar O'Reilly, who was the company clerk. nothing happened there unless he got the paperwork moving on it. Well, fortunately for us as genealogists and researchers, that's been true for a very long time. First thing to understand about military records is that military records can be a gold mine of information you can't find elsewhere, such as date and place of marriage, a woman's maiden name, when and where a soldier died, when and where a soldier was living when the soldier enlisted. For many young men, the very first record they create is a military record. They lie about their age or whatever. They enlist in the military when they're 16. They enlist in their military when they're 13. The youngest soldier in the Union Army during the Civil War claimed to have been 9 years old. By the way, he retired after the war with Spain as a major general in the U.S. Army, the famous little drummer boy of Shiloh. But anyway, a young man will sign up for the military for adventure, for pay, for just to get away from home, if you would. And they've been doing this for as long as it's been military, and this still goes on today. And sometimes a young man in the old days would show up in a military record years before he leaves a marriage record or a deed record or a tax record or or even appears in the federal census as a name. So military records are great for that, but their value is so much broader than that and so much more for you and your research. As I said, most men never serve in the military. That's true. But if you have a relative who did serve in the military, the records on that soldier, such as his place of birth, and things like that, can actually apply to as many as 5 other people. For example, in the 1860 census, the record shows that your ancestor was born in South Carolina, but you don't know where in South Carolina your ancestor was born. But you look up your ancestor's brother's Civil War record, Union or Confederate, and in that Union or Confederate Civil War service record, it shows that his brother, who was 2 years older than him, was born in Lexington District, South Carolina. All right, if the military record shows that the older brother was born in Lexington District, South Carolina, then where do you think your ancestor was born if your ancestor, according to the census, was born in South Carolina? Me, I put my money down on Lexington District, South Carolina. Or in any case, I'd certainly be looking there for the family. And that trick is particularly valuable when you're dealing with names like Smith or Davis or Jones or Williams. But oddly enough, and this is sort of a sidebar, for a state like South Carolina has a horrible record for people disappearing in it. There are 3 places in the United States where people go and they vanish. And sometimes they come out the other side in some place like Georgia or Tennessee, but people have been known to disappear for decades. Those 3 places is the state of Texas, New Orleans, Louisiana, and the state of South Carolina. I mean, as I say, there are families that have lived there for generations, for decades, and for whatever reason do not even show up in the federal census records. So these military records can clue you in on what county within a state your family comes from. And that, of course, can be a huge help. So as I say, look, it's always a good thing to look up the records of your ancestors' siblings, for information that also applies to your ancestor. But that doubly goes true when it comes to military records. Your ancestor didn't leave a military record or left military records that are devoid of information. Okay, look up his brothers. Even look up his brother-in-laws, because his brother-in-laws may lead you to widows' records of of your ancestors' sisters, and those records can tell you information like where the family comes from. Okay, moving right along here. All right, another misunderstanding about military records. People think that all military records are kept at the National Archives in Washington. That's not even true about the records that are kept in the National Archives. But for all American wars, right up to the present, always check the respective state archives and even local public libraries for military records. Uh, for example, there was a terrible fire at the National Archives St. Louis Personnel Records Center in 1973 that destroyed America's military records from 1917 to 1973. However, when you are honorably discharged from the military, you were encouraged to record your discharge in the county records that you came home to. These are usually kept in the county probate court. Now, the copy of the record that's recorded there is nothing great. It's just a discharge. It shows that your relative received an honorable discharge and the unit that your ancestor served in. But if you know your ancestor's unit, you can use that to look up records of that unit and learn something of your ancestor's experience as a soldier from the general experience of the men who served in that unit. Also, the record will show whether your ancestor received either of two awards, the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. Now, the reason that only those two medals are mentioned on a discharge is that those are the only two decorations given to the U.S. military to a soldier, a sailor, or airman that they can draw veterans benefits from. So as I say, check at the state archives, check with the local public library sources of the county where your ancestors served. See what is available. Do not just limit your research to the National Archives. Now, for the South, which we're talking about, but really for all 13 colonies, the colonial records are not at the National Archives, but are kept at the individual state archives. Now, for the South, most of those military records are published in two books. Lloyd Boxstruck's wonderful book, Virginia's Colonial Militia, and June Murdy Clark's excellent book, Colonial Soldiers of the South. And those two books are cited in your handout. However, this year, with the coming of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, we are reminded that the South also had colonial soldiers in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. And you need to check those states if you had an early Spanish ancestor during the Revolutionary War to see the possibility that maybe your Spanish colonial ancestor served with the American forces during the Revolutionary War. Believe it or not, you can join the you can join the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution if your ancestor was a soldier in the Spanish Army. In fact, I believe if your ancestor was an officer in the Spanish Army during the American Revolution, you can join the Society of the Cincinnati. Okay, now, especially for colonial and Revolutionary War records, always be sure to check with the state archives from the state from which your ancestors served. Most state archives and major research libraries have handouts to help you with their particular Revolutionary War records. Every state handled their Revolutionary War records differently. Each state has records that survived and unfortunately has record losses as well. And so it's a matter of searching each state, or rather searching the states that relate to who you are researching. And again, your ancestor didn't serve in the revolution, but maybe his brother did, or maybe his brother-in-laws did. and maybe there's military information there that can be helpful. All right, now the National Archives and Records Administration does have many, many records. We're going to talk about them this morning and this afternoon here in Central Time. We're going to talk about those records and how valuable they are. As that goes. But remember that a lot of the federal records have been lost in fires, not just in 1973, but even as early as 1814 and 1800, military records have been lost. Federal military records have been lost. Okay. All right. A few other things about the National Archives records. At the end of the American Civil War, the War Department at the end of the Civil War seized all of the Confederate records that they could. And it's good that they did, because surely the records would not have survived otherwise. They also have the records of the Continental Congress, and they have the National Archives as federal military records to 1917. The 1973 fire only destroyed the records from 1918 to 1973. It has a very useful website that has some records for World War II that can be searched. Many of its records are on microfilm. Now, there's a wonderful new website called National Archives Catalog. And what this does is this indexes the records that the National Archives so far has scanned onto its site. The National Archives has as an objective to scan every historical record that it has that is open to the public, and that's billions of records. The day is supposedly going to come when we can type in a name, and every record where your ancestor's name appears will be available to you at the touch of your fingers. You may have to use some filters and such to select exactly what of those records you want to see. There could be so many of them. Okay, now records of the National Archives from 1918 and later are kept at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. As I say, it burned in a fire in 1973. If your relatives' records were in that fire, I've got a lot of good news for you. First off, since 1973, the National Archives has been spending more than $1 million a year searching the country for copies of the records that were lost in the fire. So by all means, even if your your relatives' records were supposedly in the fire, contact the National Archives anyway and see if they have a copy of the records. The other good news is they're now using CAT scans and X-rays on the damaged records from the 1973 fire, and they are slowly recovering many of the records that were fused together in the fire and were previously thought to be lost. In a rare moment of making the right decision, the National Archives did not throw out the damaged records from the fire. And so these new wonderful toys that we have are helping the National Archives to recover the information from the damaged records. So even if you have checked before for your ancestors, your relative service records that were in the fire, check again every couple of years, and you could be very pleasantly surprised. I should say, however, that unfortunately my father's records from his service in the Korean conflict still have not been recovered. But I have high hopes. Military records are widely available on a number of subscription sites, including Ancestry, particularly on Fold3. And I believe now if you subscribe to Ancestry, they throw in a subscription to Fold3. If you don't have any of these sites, many of these sites are available at your local public library for free for the public's use. such as Ancestry and Fold 3. Fold 3 is particularly interesting because it has the War of 1812 pensions on it, which I believe are also available on the free site familysearch.org. Okay. All right. Now, the National Archives, and there's a long and colorful story behind this, but after the Civil War, the United States government shoved all the records, Union and Confederate, that it had into warehouses and just locked the door. And nobody really had access to it. Then, as the years went by, more and more federal soldiers and their widows needed access to service records to prove the service for purposes of a pension. So Congress allocated money in the 1880s to begin creating abstracts of military service records of federal Civil War soldiers. And these were done in a very hasty manner, and they don't contain all of the records. So look in your handout for Union Civil War service, Union Civil War service, and it'll explain to you what records the National Archives has that are not in a federal soldier's compiled service record. Anyway, this was done very hastily because the clerks who were doing it were afraid that the government was going to cut off the money to them sometime in the future. Well, the government didn't do that. So these same clerks went on to abstract compiled service records from the War of 1812, the war with Spain, the war with Mexico, the War of 1812, the American Revolution. Finally, when they ran out of any other service records to do compiled service records for, they did them for the Confederate records, which is not a bad thing because by the time they got to the Confederate records, they knew better what they were doing, and they did an excellent job on what the War Department had in the way of Confederate records. Now, the content of these military records can vary widely. Sometimes all you get is a card that shows that your ancestor served in a particular unit at a particular moment. Sometimes you will find in a service record where the next of kin is filing a claim for the money that was still owed by the soldiers. I had a Civil War ancestor, and I was pretty sure that his father was Jesse Hammondry, based on the 1850 and 1860 federal census, but I did not have absolute proof. I do now because my ancestor left me a memoir of his 4 years with, okay, I see the question. I'll answer it in just a moment. Anyway, I have my ancestor's Confederate memoirs. He served 4 years in Robert E. Lee's army, and his memoirs are 1.5 pages long, double spaced. But in that, he mentions his brother's death. In his brother's compiled service record, there is a claim by Jesse Hammondry for that soldier, any money due that soldier, as the father of that soldier. So by proving that he was Stephen Hammondry's father, he's also therefore proving he was my ancestor Samuel Hammondry's father as well. Okay, the 2 books of colonial Southern soldiers was Lloyd Bachstruth's Virginia's Colonial Militia, and Murdy June Clark's book, Colonial Soldiers of the South. You have a handout on military records that I sent, and both books are cited in it. Okay, county of birth can be found in enlistments in the United States Army, 1798 to 1914. And those enlistments, which include Native American warriors serving with the U.S. Army, is available on Ancestry, and it's also available on Fold 3. But when a soldier, whether an officer or an enlisted man, joined the Army from 1800 on, they had to give their county and state of birth, and also the details of their service right up to and including their discharge. wonderful source of information. The Union Civil War soldiers, their service records also give you county and state of birth, which can help you to determine where your family was at a certain time. The Confederate service records usually are not as complete, but if your Confederate ancestor received a medical discharge, his medical discharge is in the service record, and it too will give you county and state of birth. So that Smith family, it's been driving you up the wall for years. Where were they in 1860? Where were they in 1850? Where were they in 1830 even? The answer can be in a military service record. Okay. Now, your ancestor who served in the military could have been entitled to free land for that service. And being able to identify land that your ancestor received for military service is a wonderful thing. It makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside when you can go to that land. And there, see, a Walmart is standing over the site now. But actually, again, the land records for the wars. Okay. A quick question here. Are there Confederate hospital records? Yes. The Confederate hospital records that the War Department captured are included in the Confederate compiled service records. However, there is a mountain of Confederate hospital records, none for Rome, Georgia that I'm aware of, but for Confederate hospitals at the University of Texas that were never incorporated into the National Archives records or the War Department's records. And you need to contact the University of, well, you can't because they have no index. But look in the records. You've got a handout on Confederate records. The Confederate medical records are included there. When looking for records of a Civil War hospital, records of a Civil War hospital, North or South, always ask contact the public library where the hospital was located, because they get that question constantly, and they can tell you what survives that they know of for that hospital's records, including any cemetery where the dead from the hospital were buried and any registrations of the dead. Atlanta, for example, was a huge center for hospitals in Confederate hospitals, and the Atlanta History Center and the Georgia Archives have extensive records of the soldiers, Union and Confederate, who are buried at Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta who died in the Confederate hospitals in Atlanta. Now, again, excuse me, getting back to the land records here. All right, the soldiers of the American Revolution were promised land by the Continental Congress. They never received it. Congress was so broke they gave the land to land speculators who succeeded in bringing down the whole economy as a result. 9 individual states gave bounty land to their respective veterans, and those soldiers are listed in Lloyd Boxbrook's book, Revolutionary War Bounty Land Grants Awarded by State Governments. Now, from yes, the lady is asking, some Georgia Civil War soldiers ended up at the federal prison at Rockford, Illinois. That is true. Look in the handout that I sent you on Confederate service records. The National Archives has the records of Confederate prisoners of war, including the prison camps where they stayed. If the Confederate soldier died in federal custody, that should be mentioned in his Confederate compiled service record. But there can be other federal prison camp records that relate to your Confederate ancestor. These records are indexed on Ancestry. Those records are indexed on Ancestry. All right. Now, later, the United States government gives land, starting with the War of 1812, starts giving land to veterans. Most of this land was granted between 1842 and 1855. 550,000 claims were filed by veterans, widows of veterans, and next of kin of veterans for military bounty land between 1842 and 1855. These records are at the National Archives. The National Archives has been indexing them, and you can see the index, which I think is just about complete. You can use that index on Fold 3, which should be available at your local public library and should be available to you if you have an Ancestry subscription. But anyway, Fold 3. Now, these bounty land certificates for wars between 1775 and 1855 are absolutely staggering in the amount of personal information they can give you. You may discover that your ancestor was entitled to military bounty land and filed a claim for it, even though you did not know your ancestor even served in the military. It's easy to check this index on Fold 3. Now, if your ancestor filed for military bounty land, in that claim, he will tell you where and when he served, which tells you if he's enlisted for the War of 1812 or the war with Mexico or whatever. It will tell you where he was at the moment he enlisted, which is probably where his family was also at the time he enlisted. If the soldier did not live long enough to file a claim for land, and he did not have to have died in the war, he could have died any time. But if he did not live long enough to file a claim for the land, his widow could file for the land. And if she files for the land, she has to explain when and where her husband enlisted. She has to explain when and where she married him, her maiden name when she married him, and when and where he died. These records document thousands and thousands of marriages for which no other record survives. They document thousands of dates of death that no other record survives. Now, if the widow and the veteran, neither of them lived to claim the land, the next of kin could claim the land. And if the next of kin is not the widow, the next of kin is going to be the soldier's children. So you get, if the soldier and the widow did not live to apply for the land, you get a list of all 14 of their children, including the married names of the daughters and their husbands, because the daughter married women could not claim the land. Their husbands had to claim it for them. So that proves all that many more marriages for you. And so, as I say, even if you don't know if any member of your family applied for military land, it's worthwhile checking this anyway, just on the chance. As I say, these records are rich in information. Oh, and I should mention, if a widow files for a claim, she also obviously has to explain where she is living at the time she's filing the claim. Also, the next of kin would also have to list where they are living at the time they are filing for the claim. All right, now there's one other great land record that is that's not talked about enough, but should be. And to get to that, if your relatives, rather, let me put it that way, if your relatives, black or white, served in the Union military, then they could claim free federal land in what was called homestead land. Now, when you homesteaded land, you had to live on the land a certain period of time. I think it was 8 years And if you lived on the land for 8 years, you got to keep the land. All you had to pay was the paperwork cost. However, if you were a black or white veteran or the widow of a black or white veteran of the Union service, they cut 1 year off of that time limit, 1 year for every year of military service. Your ancestor served in the Union Army for 3 years. So instead of having to wait 8 years to get his homestead, he can get it in 5. But of course, he has to explain all of this in his homestead land claim, and you get the homestead land claims from the National Archives. Although there's a lot of related records on the website of the Bureau of Land Management that you can see. Now, the most famous of the military records, and of course, there's going to be plenty of these because the South was so involved in wars. I mean, wars in the South before 1861 were almost like a government employment program. There were so many young men who signed up to serve in these campaigns against the Indians, campaigns against Mexico, campaigns against the British, and on and on. But as they say, the most famous of these are the pension files. The United States government gave pensions for all the American wars from the American Revolution through the war with Mexico, and then also for the Civil War as well. But we'll talk more about go into more detail about that right now. Now, for the American wars before 1861, Virgil White has published a series of indexes to these pensions. Also, these pensions are indexed on Fold 3 and I believe on Ancestry. But these are for the American Revolution, the Indian Wars, the Old Wars, the War of 1812, and the War with Mexico. Again, it takes you no time at all to look in these indexes and see if you recognize names of people important to your research who are applying for pensions. And again, this is much like the bounty. They're indexed by the name of the soldier, however, and usually give you the name of the widow if the widow is applying. Now, again, the same basic information. If the soldier served, he's going to tell you when and where he served. If the soldier did not live and where he's living at the time he's applying for a pension. If he doesn't make it, his widow might apply for a pension. She will tell you when and where he served. He will tell you when and where she is when she's applying for the pension. And she will tell you when and where he died. And usually the widow gives you the maiden name and when and where she married him. And again, as I say, thousands and thousands of marriages are documented, and women's maiden names are documented, and sometimes additional information is included in this that are just unexpected benefits. For example, many years ago, I researched a man in Hall County for a client. I don't do clients anymore, by the way. But back in the days when I did do clients, I helped this gentleman out. And his ancestor died in 1864, and he outlived his wife. So there's no widow. Nonetheless, I checked the Indian Wars pension. I checked all these books for him anyway, just on the off chance that maybe he applied for a pension. And to my shock, it turned out that there was a pension file listed for him under Indian Wars. I ordered a copy of the pension for my client, and it turned out that the old man had remarried in the last few years of his life. Believe it or not. They did, he had he married some young lady old enough to be young enough to be his granddaughter in his last years. And when she was an old woman, she applied for his pension. And the pension was just wonderful. She gave the maiden name of his first wife and when he married her and when she died, as well as when he died, and explained that he served in the Cherokee Indian removal of 1838. And of course, she gave information on her maiden name and marriage. But the coolest thing about the pension file is she included the only piece of paper her husband left her, which was an agreement between him and his brothers and sisters dividing up their father's property. There was no estate for the soldier's father because the kids just got together and divided it between them and signed a piece of paper to that effect. And here it was in the pension. The family, the descendants of this old guy, none of them had ever heard of this second wife. None of them knew about his military service, and all this wonderful information came to them. I just had a question about my clients. Well, I started out charging people by the hour, but that really did not work out. So I was taught how to be a researcher in the Jim Rockford School of Investigation. And as you recall, Jim Rockford charged $100 a day. Well, that's what I charged too. Now that was back when $100 meant something, but I charged by the day. Um, but let me say in my defense that if I found something after that, I just sent it on to the client. For example, I was looking for another client and I stumbled into something I knew another earlier client would be interested in, I'd send it along to them anyway, just as a goodwill bonus, shall we say. But I charge by the day. And there's a lot of good information out there. In fact, entire books on how to be a private researcher and how to charge people for your work, and with a lot of good and helpful tips. Also, I'm sure there's free information on that on the internet as well, particularly from the Board of Certification for Genealogists. Do you have to be certified to do genealogical research for people? No, you don't. When I started out, I was too poor to become a member of the board, to be certified by the Board of Genealogists. And after I was a success at it, I didn't need them. If people wanted to be certified or a certified researcher, then they could go to the Board of Certification. I just was not going to fool with that. And I don't want to reflect badly on the modern Board of Certification, of which I know absolutely nothing. But in my time, the Board of Certification of Genealogists had a very unsavory reputation. But that was way back then. Not saying anything about now. But no, you don't have to be certified. I did have a lot of people who tried to hire me to testify in genealogical matters in court cases, and I turned them down because I was not certified. Instead, I referred them to a genealogist that I hold a great deal of respect for, who is certified, and gave them that person's website, and they went there. So I would steer their business to them. I mean, if what you needed, in all honesty, really required someone who was certified, I would recommend someone to you, and you could go to them. The Revolutionary War pension claims for the South, the Revolutionary War pension claims for the South that begin in 1818 and later are free on the site Southern Campaigns of the American Revolution. And because these are transcripts of the Revolutionary War pension claims, you can search all of the claims at one time for names. So if your ancestor name appears in another Revolutionary War soldier's pension claim, you could find that name that way. If you are looking for all Revolutionary War pension claims of the South, that mention your surname, you can search for it that way. If your ancestors served in a particular battle or campaign, you can search all the Southern Revolutionary War pension claims for that battle or that campaign. Now, Fold 3 has scanned on it all of the Revolutionary War pension claims for 1818 and later. And they are indexed, but they're not indexed nearly as well as the typescripts are of the Southern campaigns of the American Revolution. And something that I wish someone would do is go through all of the pension files, page by page, for everyone who is mentioned in the pension files, not just the Revolutionary War soldiers. Because in many of these Revolutionary War pension claims, there are neighbors and relatives and others who step forward as witnesses, and they have valuable information too. Like, I have known this soldier ever since I was a little boy. Fine, let's find out when and where he was a little boy, and that will tell us where the Revolutionary War soldier was at that time. And I've actually used that information to find a Revolutionary War soldier who was missing in the pension file. I mean, missing in the census records. I could find the Revolutionary War soldier's pension. I could not find the soldier in the census records, but thanks to the witnesses, I knew where he was, where he should have been in the census records, at least where they are in the census records. Federal census records for 1840 and 1885 and 1900 indicate military service. And I might have just learned the other day, showing everybody can learn new things. The 1930 federal census also indicates military service. The 1930 federal census also indicates military service. There are many good books out there that can help us in research. Now, of course, there's basic books on how to do research, but there are specific books on how to research the American Revolution, or even how to search the War of 1812. Some states have books that list all of the War with Mexico veterans who are known to have served from that particular state. Alabama has such a book. There are books on specific battles, campaigns, and leaders. Now, you're saying you understand that these books on a battle, a campaign, or whatever can show you something of your ancestors' experience. And that's great, and that's fine. But let me give you another big trick on that. If you check the footnotes can lead you to diaries and letters and regimental histories of your ancestors' unit. And even if your ancestor left you no letters, your ancestor left you no memoirs, your ancestor did not publish a book about their military experience, if you found some original letters or a diary of somebody who was in the same regiment at the same time using these footnotes, would that not be just as good? Would that not be just as good or almost as good as having letters or a diary from your relative who served? And I have known people who checked the footnotes, and to lo and behold, to their surprise, they actually found letters that their ancestor had left in an archive or library. Now, many archives and libraries catalog their manuscript collections by military unit or by war, as well as by subject and personal name and things like that. So, like, for example, you go to the Georgia Archives and and you go to their catalog of their manuscript collections. You can look up your ancestor's regiment and you can find out what diaries and letters and memoirs from that regiment are at the Georgia Archives. And again, once in a blue moon, you get lucky and there's your ancestor mentioned for some reason in those records. There is a national database of manuscript collections in archives and libraries. It is called Archive Grid. That's one word, ARCHIVEGRID, Archive Grid. It's a little hard to get into sometimes, but go to archive, ARCHIVEGRID.com. Go there. And once you've got it up and working, you can search for diaries and letters and whatever of your ancestor, of his battles, of his campaigns, of his regiment or his military unit that might be out there. Now, you're welcome, Robin. Okay, now for more modern campaigns, many from the Vietnam era, World War II, etc., even the Civil War, there are websites devoted to specific regiments and campaigns and battles. So don't be the least bit surprised. My father, for example, his old unit in Korea had a website so that all the veterans of that unit could keep in touch with each other. And they would have an annual reunion. And my father had the best time, and he'd fly out. He never missed a reunion once he had access to this website. So, and even if there's no one left from a unit or whatever, sometimes the descendants or historians are maintaining websites of a bomber wing or a ship or a military unit. One of the handouts that were given to you today gives you the address of the military archives of each branch of the United States military. Now, these days, they aren't a lot of help like they used to be because their budgets have been cut to the bone. All the federal budgets have been cut to the bone and have been for years. And now all the federal agencies can barely keep their doors open, never mind doing their jobs. And I'm afraid things are going to get worse. But you can write to the respective military archives listed and ask them for copies of any records they have. Ask them for what records do they have for your ancestors' ship or plane or regiment or unit or service, male or female. For example, in World War II, all the World War II units and ships and squadrons and such had yearbooks with pictures and information about what went on during the war and such. They're not, I don't know exactly how to put this. I don't mean any disrespect in this. They are written in a very positive form, and they sometimes exaggerate military service and sometimes exaggerate military success, and sometimes things that didn't go right sort of got left out. But still, that's a wonderful thing to have. And you've got an elderly relative, say the daughter or son of a World War II veteran, and you know the veterans unit, contact the appropriate military archives and see if you can photocopy these yearbooks. It would make a great Christmas present. It would make a great Christmas present. Okay. At the National Gravesite Locator, they have still incomplete records of service personnel who are buried in national cemeteries across the country. That's another project that the government is working on. And the idea is one day everyone who's buried in a national cemetery will be their information will be available on a database. But that can be a way of finding that missing relative of yours. I've searched and searched for a very important Civil War veteran from North Georgia for the longest. And when I finally found him, the reason his family, his descendants, nobody knew where he and his wife were buried. And when I finally found him, it turned out he was buried at the National Cemetery in Marietta with his wife. And so that may be where some of your missing relatives are. Okay. Now, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the War of 1812, the Sons of the American Revolution, many of these organizations have family files and other resources. The Daughters of the American Revolution are famous for their wonderful resources and their wonderful library in Washington, D.C. If you're going on a research trip to Washington, D.C. for, say, the period of the American Revolution or researching way back, I highly recommend, I highly recommend the DAR library at 1776 D Street near the White House. It's open to everybody, and it is a fabulous research facility. Also, DAR applications are open to the public unless the person who submitted the application asks that they be closed. And these are rich in genealogical information. Of course, the old claims and old records are often undocumented, but the DAR has gotten much, much better about that. Also, the DAR website is a gold mine of valuable research material. Other patriotic organizations also have resources. Okay, things you need to do for your military ancestor. And this actually brings us back full circle, if you would, in this. Don't just go for name and service. My ancestor was in the 11th Georgia Militia during the War of 1812. Find out what the 11th Georgia Militia did by consulting the sources at the Georgia Archives for the War of 1812, or books that have been written on the campaigns that the 11th would have experienced. In Georgia, for example, there's a series of books called History of the Georgia Militia, 1783 to 1861 by Gordon Smith. Fabulous books. Will tell you all about those experiences. If you are researching relatives who are still, the service of relatives who are still alive, by all means, interview those relatives while they're still here with you to share information. You would be surprised the things that veterans never get around to telling their families. Every year, you hear some story of some veteran who is belatedly getting the Medal of Honor or is being honored for being at Pearl Harbor or the Battle of the Bulge. And the descendants are there saying, we never knew any of this. He never, I lived with him for 50 years and he never said word one about any of this. But anyway, interview the veterans and get as you would all of your relatives who are living storehouses of information. And I sent you a handout. No, I didn't either. I should have sent you a handout on how to conduct a family interview. If you'd like a copy of that or any of the handouts that I have that are left over from when I ran a genealogy library, contact me at GENWS at HIWAAY.net. That is again, GENWS at HIWAAY.net. And I'll be happy to answer your questions or send you handouts or both. Visit the historic sites. Unfortunately, in the world we live in today, fewer and fewer people are visiting historical sites, cemeteries, museums. Fewer and fewer people are visiting archives and libraries. But for the South in these early wars, there are many wonderful historic sites where you can share your ancestors' experience. Horseshoe Bend, the great battle with the indigenous people in the War of 1812, Horseshoe Bend is a National Historic Site. Yes, certainly. Please share my email address with anyone. I'm happy with that. Okay. Horseshoe Bend is a National Historic Site. Fort Mims, which began the Indian troubles in Alabama, is a state historic site, as is Fort Jackson that ended those troubles. When you visit Savannah, there's so much to see and do in Savannah, but put Fort Jackson, a War of 1812 fort that was also used in the Civil War, on your list of places to visit. Also, New Orleans has sites connected with the War of 1812. Attend veterans memorials, and there's ceremonies held all the time for veterans, from the American Revolution right up to our most recent conflicts. Show everyone that we have not forgotten. So now I'm going, I know that this talk did not go really so much about the South as much as the whole country for military records before 1861, and that's fine. This way, everybody gets to share in it. But I want to end this with a question that really has nothing to do with the South or these particular wars. When you visit the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., and I recommend it and the World War II Memorial. My father, before he passed, got to see the Korean War Memorial. But when you are at Washington, D.C., and you visit the Vietnam War Memorial, which is open 24 hours a day, all year round, you go through a small grove of trees, and there's a statue of 3 Vietnam War soldiers, and they're facing down on the memorial. When I used to take students to Washington, D.C. on field trips, and I would take them to the monument, the question of the day is, what does a monument represent? What does a monument represent? And of course, nobody ever knew. No one ever knew. I mean, obviously, it represents America and Vietnam, but what did it really represent? What it is that 3 men in the statue are ghosts, and they're there to see if we've forgotten them. Remember our veterans. All right, let's have some questions.
Okay, so I'll open it up to the class. Please leave your camera off, but turn your microphone on because we are recording. And while I'm waiting, I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay, while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I have a couple of my own. You mentioned America 250 celebration is coming up very soon. Are you involved with anything like any kind of a local or national or state level way to celebrate?
Well, not locally, because I live in Bluntsville, Alabama, and I'm sort of waiting till 1814 when Andrew Jackson burned the place to the ground. We're thinking about reenacting that by burning Bluntsville down, which sort of civic improvements. But no, South Carolina is going whole hog on this 250th anniversary thing, and it's spilling over onto the Georgia side of the Savannah River. And I'm not on any of their committees or things like that, but whenever they need help with research or information, they know, call me, and they do, or email me, call me, whatever, send a smoke signal, whatever, write to me, and I help them every way I can. But they've got so many people, so many good people involved with the 250th American Revolution anniversary in South Carolina. They don't call on me very often, but I'm there for them when they do. And they're open to the public. You can go to them you can go to it on the internet. Now, Kettle Creek Revolutionary War Battlefield will be celebrating its 250th anniversary as well. And I'm heavily involved with Kettle Creek and I have been for 50 years now, since before the bicentennial of the battle. And I hope by the 250th birthday, I will have the big definitive great book on the Battle of Kettle Creek and the history of the battlefield. That's been my involvement so far. Some more good questions.
Okay, I'm still waiting for the class to pipe in, but I've got a couple more. Um, you mentioned a lot of really great resources in this presentation. But let's say somebody comes up to you, because I know you've done a lot of, like you said, case studies and research for individuals. But if somebody came up to you and said, "What is the first step I'm going to take? What is the second step I'm going to take? What is the third step I'm going to take?" Um, can you kind of like condense it and do like a 1, 2, 3 for the class?
Yeah, okay. The first step is you've got the soldier and the unit. The soldier, or shall we say the soldier and the service. Um, the soldier and the service. Okay, the next thing you need to do is to check at the state archives, for any books or records about the war, the campaign, the regiment, all of that. And you need to check at the state archives, and they probably have handouts at the state archives that will help you on this. And you check at that, and you look up the um, on the handout. Check into the sources for your ancestors' experience. What records survive of the unit? What records survive of the campaign? And what, etc. Now, the third step could also be the second step, and that is go on the internet, and search on the internet again for the regiment and the campaign. And on your first search, of course, throw in the ancestor's name too. You might find your ancestor listed on somebody's website that is remembering the unit that your ancestor served, your relative served in. Because this all applies, by the way, not just to the War of 1812 or the Civil War, but it applies to the Second Gulf War or Afghanistan or any of those campaigns. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is go for the unit, go for the experience. The least you're going to get out of doing that is to find out history about your ancestor and what they lived through and what they saw, which is great. But you never know. When you're going through all this stuff, you may find some personal information there as well. There was a question about Vietnam that, or comment about Vietnam on the screen a moment ago.
Yes, Bill from Texas. He says the Vietnam Memorial Soldier statues were a later addition, not a part of Maya Lin's original design on conception, largely due to demands from opponents such as an abstract original design, the wall.
Yeah, I like your politics and such. Religion, I'd rather not get into that, but let me say that the architect who designed the memorial, and this should not make any difference, she was third generation Chinese. The objection was that the monument was designed by someone from Vietnam. And I personally would not have had a problem with that. I mean, it's a beautiful monument, it's a brilliant idea. But the architect, if that matters to you, the architect was third generation Chinese American, not Vietnamese. But anyway, it's a magnificent monument. I like the statue very much, and I like the monument very much. One of when I took these people on tours and such, I had some incredible experiences, and one I will never forget for the life of me was when I was at the Vietnam Memorial, and this elderly lady and her daughter were by the wall, and the elderly lady said, "I can't find him. Let's just go." And I ran up and said, "No, no, no. We've got an index. Tell me who you're looking for, and I'll go get the park ring. We'll look him up in the index and find him." And they gave me a name, and I went and got it, and um, brought back a park ranger so they could make a rubbing of the name. And the lady turned to me and said, "Thank you." And then as she's walking away, she said, "That's my son." And I said, when I heard her say that, I should have been expecting that, but there's just something about that that just went right through me. Some more good comments or questions. These are excellent questions and comments.
Hi, Robert. This is Kathy Brewster. Thank you for helping me a few weeks ago on my ancestor from the dark corner of Georgia who was at Fort Defiance, Calaby Creek. Before I went to the National Archives, I was there and at the Library of Congress, pulled some of your books while I was at the Library of Congress, very helpful. Still trying to find out the date that he died and what happened to him, but I did get a little further, and this is maybe a research thing for people. I was able to locate that there had been a letter sent about all of the wounded and dead in this particular battle, and I found it off a footnote in a secondary source. Asked the Library of Congress, asked National Archives, they pulled it for me. It was also published in a newspaper, the Savannah Evening Ledger, and he doesn't show up on it. So now I'm back to working the Georgia angle and planning on going to Atlanta or Morrow, Georgia, and to Elbert County and Lincoln County and Wilkes County.
Okay, you may have already done this, but this hits to something I've just discussed. Contact the National Archives through their website
I did that.
and see if if somebody filed a military bounty land claim for him.
No, we did that while I was there.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I think it's his, but as you pointed out to me, his widow got money in Georgia, so I'm gonna follow the money now.
Well, that's what you always need to do. Now, send me an email. No, I beg your pardon, don't. Oh, hold on here. I'm sure it's in the handouts. The National Archives, the War Department gave gave bounty land back during the war, right after the War of 1812, to widows and orphans of the War of 1812. And this is separate from the bounty land records I'm talking about here. And if you will send me it's in your handout, your military records handouts about this, the half pay pensions for widows, where the orphans, instead of getting the half pay, they got federal land. And that's in your handouts on military records, other than for the Civil War, which was sent. And all the information is there. If you can't find it, by all means, drop me another email and I'll send you the information. I published those records for Georgia's soldiers.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I see a couple more in the chat box here. Let's look at them. Let's see here. Lori from Nevada. Lori, did you want to unmute and ask your question directly?
Certainly, and I forgot to mention in there that my father came home a disabled veteran. He was drafted from Montana. And while he was gone, my mother took my 4 brothers and moved back to Idaho to be with her family. And he came back. He did tell me he saw the Statue of Liberty from the porthole of a hospital ship, and that's about all I know. Would I look in both states?
Yes, I would check. Well, I don't think I would check with Idaho. I would check with Montana because, well, I tell you what, check with both of them just to be sure. And
Yeah,
also stream the movie A River Runs Through It. But sorry, that's
I've seen that.
But anyway, check the state archives of both. Also go through the National Archives website to see what they have on his service record. Yes, I know his service record would have been in the fire of 1973, but
Yeah.
maybe they found a substitute for it, or maybe they've CAT scanned the records and they can read it now. Now, in addition to that, if you know what unit he was in, and you should be able to do that because I presume also contact the Veterans Administration, because the Veterans Administration probably has a nice thick file on him that was not in St. Louis when the fire took place. Now, if you've got his unit, go on the internet and look for his unit. And don't be
Yeah,
the least
he-
bit, or
He
his
never
ship.
said, go ahead.
Oh.
I was gonna say, he never, ever, ever talked about the war.
Oh, that's
No.
fine. What I'm
Yeah.
doing is offering you ways of
Yeah.
finding out what he didn't tell you.
Okay,
And so one way is to go on the internet and look up his unit. And you might even, if you're extremely lucky, it is still possible you might even through that website contact somebody who knew him when he was in service and served with him. I've had that happen with
mhm,
people, and that's a possibility. Also, on the handout that we've sent you, that gives you the military archives, whichever branch of service he was in, I don't think I would even try by email. They're so shorthanded there. At the very least, write to them and ask them for any what records do you have of this unit, like unit yearbooks or ship yearbooks or whatever, on the unit. And he probably has yearbooks for that unit, which will have information about what he saw and where he was during the war.
mhm.
I had an Uncle Jake, and I dearly loved him, and he was first rate. If I ever had a son, I was going to name him for my Uncle Jake. But my Uncle Jake, you had to find out from another source that he was on Omaha Beach on D-Day.
Ooh,
And you ask, and I mean, he would tell you about the 2 times when, as a patrolman, he was shot and left for dead. He would tell you all about that. He wouldn't tell you what he saw on Omaha Beach to the day he died. He refused to see the longest day, because it brought back too many memories for him.
yeah,
But anyway, you can find out something, if you would, from websites devoted to the unit and from unit histories that may be available to you through that branch of the military's archives. And
okay,
they'll
great,
make
thank you
copies,
very much.
they'll make copies for you, by the way, for a very reasonable price.
All right, thank you. Now, I want to make a comment on the Vietnam Wall. I saw it years
ma'am.
ago, but then I went a few years ago as a guardian on an honor flight, Nevada. A lot of Vietnam veterans were there, and that had such an emotional impact on them. It just was amazing. I mean, these veterans, we had several different war veterans there from, World War II and Korea, but the Vietnam veterans, they were so impressed by that wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, I thought it was a brilliant concept, and whatever reason the statues were put up, I like the statues too.
Oh, I do too. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Okay, any other questions from the class? While I'm waiting for more questions to come in, you mentioned about the burn files that some of them can be recovered. I actually, oh gosh, like 20 years ago, I wrote to the National Archive, or excuse me, to the Personnel Records Center, and I wanted to get my father's World War II records, and they told me in a letter that they had been burned. And then years later, I found out about a company called Twisted Twigs, and they were doing the recovery of the burn files. So I wrote them, or I should say I contacted them, and it was a pretty nominal fee actually. They actually recovered my father's burn files, and they sent it to me in digital form. And there are some burn marks, on the edges. And I was amazed. I mean, like I was told by the National Archives, like I said, 20 years ago, that they were gone, that they were destroyed in the fire. But like you mentioned, there are now ways to recover those burn files, and I was certainly pleased with what I got about my father's burn files.
And they will get to all of them eventually.
Yeah, there must have been probably 60 pages at least in what they sent me. I was amazed. I mean, it included hospital records, um, just amazing stuff. I was taken aback. It was just a wonderful experience
Well,
with
that's one of the things about all federal pension files, even the old ones. That's an important lesson. For example, a typical Civil War federal pension was over 100 pages long. And when you write to the National Archives, they only send you the most important papers, not the whole file. But if you get the opportunity when you're at the National Archives, order the whole file because you could be very pleasantly surprised. I had an ancestor who died in the Union Army. Everybody in the family had a copy of his pension from the National Archives. I just happened to be in Washington and I ordered the actual pension file. Nobody knew what happened to his widow, but written on the outside of the pension file, on the file folder itself, was her date of death and the cemetery where she was buried. And nobody'd ever copied that because nobody copies the outside of the pension file. So there could, what I'm trying to, don't get your hopes up, but in the original War of 1812 file, if it's not all original Civil War file or whatever, maybe there's something buried in there that nobody thought to copy before that's important to you. Civil War pension files are valuable beyond the obvious. For example, if your ancestor had to change his name, or there's 2 or 3 women claiming to be his wife, or something like that, there can be all sorts of family history, some of which you might not really want to know, but still. And for African Americans, the Civil War pension files are wonderful because they frequently give you the names of everybody's previous owner. So you can, find out where the family lived before emancipation.
I
I
just
have
had a,
Oh,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Suzanne.
No,
I
no,
was
you
just
go.
gonna say, I just had a thought on getting the Montana records. I'm gonna be in Helena for about a week and a half. Would it be worth going there and trying to pull the records while I'm there?
Okay, before you go to any archives or any library on a road trip, always check the website first and make sure they're going to be open. And you might even send them a query and explain what you're trying to do and ask them, by the way, this is what I'm planning a field trip to Helena. Here's what I'm trying to find information on my father who served in blah, 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 blah.
Yeah,
Uh, uh, is stopping at your archives worthwhile? Is there something I should know? And you can get all sorts of responses. For example, my least favorite state archives in the entire country is Pennsylvania. You actually have to have an appointment to use their state archives. And
wow.
and on top of that, you have to let them know ahead of time what records you want so they can pull them for you. Um, but that's the state archives. That, by the way, that's not the Pennsylvania Historical Society, which is first rate. But anyway, and it's similar situations across the country. Years ago, I had to use the Public Record Office of the City of London. And so I rolled ahead to them. They said, that'd be just wonderful. We'll be here waiting for you with bells on. Uh, just ring the doorbell when you come. Okay, I came there at the very moment appointed, and there's a big sign on the door said closed for our annual 2-week inventory. And I'd flown thousands of miles and to be there on that particular day and moment, and nobody thought to tell me, oh, by the way, we're going to be closed.
Well, this trip
Well,
is basically to
fortunately, I
go
had
spend
time next
Thanksgiving
week.
with friends.
Yeah. Well, again, that's part of the problem. You don't know if the day that you were going to go to the archives, we're not celebrating National Montana Day or Buffalo Day or whatever they celebrate in Montana. We have that problem here in Alabama when people come to the state archives and the state archives is closed for some weird holiday that's not commemorated anywhere but in Alabama. Um, so, but that's the state archives that, by the way, that's not the Pennsylvania Historical Society, which is first rate. And you can get all sorts of responses. For example, my least favorite state archives in the entire country is Pennsylvania. You actually have to have an appointment to use their state archives. And That's why it's always important to check ahead. Oh, and they might also tell you, by the way, we don't have military records. We keep those with the National Guard, which is, up the street. Here's their contact information. Tennessee has a lot of its military records are kept by its state adjutant general, which is not a big deal, except it's not in their nice, new, wonderful state archives building.
You talked about getting the military file from the archives. Recently, I got a Civil War ancestor. Actually, he's an uncle of my direct line. But anyhow, interesting. I actually got that from Twisted Twigs also. Not a burn file, obviously, but she went to the archives and made me a copy. But one of the things I found really interesting about the file and the pension file came with it. The widow put in a claim for a pension, but I guess they started asking a lot of questions about her past. And she actually dropped her request for a pension because she'd had a marriage prior to the soldier, that she was putting in a claim for the pension for her husband, who had died in the war. But by the way, he was at Andersonville. But anyhow, they closed the pension file on her request because they wanted information about her prior marriage, and it was too emotionally painful for her to discuss the first marriage. So rather than divulge the information about the first marriage, she actually dropped the claim. Have you ever come across that before?
Oh, yeah, yes, indeed. In fact, one of my most important discoveries involved such a pension. But the pension law had an immorality clause where you couldn't be the veteran's common law wife, and you could be into any questionable sexual activity, shall we say. And anyway, this was this gunfighter I was researching, and he married and left 2 or 3 women, and then he married he went to live with this woman in a common law marriage and had kids by her. And then he left out west and he took 2 or 3 other women as wives. And anyway, the only living official wife that he had died. And so his common law wife in Tennessee, on behalf of her children, filed for a pension. And they would have given her the pension. I mean, she filed for the pension after the official wife had died. The official wife never applied for a pension. The common law wife did, but they turned her down because she was a common law wife. And also because the children were illegitimate. That violated the immorality clause. Now, let's not get to whether that's right, wrong, or what about it, but that they took that very seriously, and I could understand why. Because that's got to be a problem in every conflict, because and particularly today, because you have all these people who show up claiming to be widows or spouses or whatever, and then you throw in the common law part of it. How do you the Civil War was really bad. 1 out of every 4 federal pensions, well, they would run tests on the federal pensions, and 1 out of every 4 people who were getting a federal pension did not qualify for one. And they would have a Civil War soldier who died at Andersonville, and there'd be 3 or 4 women filing claims that they were his wife, and people claiming that they were his parents and claiming to be his children, and all of this. And see my book, Ghosts and Shadows of Andersonville. I give you some of the most spectacular cases of this pension stuff. But in a place like Andersonville, where people died under assumed names and people did or didn't die there or whatever, that only made the situation even more complicated. But that actually benefits you as a researcher, because if there's issues involved, the government spent a fortune on investigators to check out every pension application and to make sure. For example, you write in and you say, I'm a poor widow. My husband left 20 years ago for out west. I'd never heard back from him. I'm sure he's dead. And I'm his legitimate wife, but if he's dead, could you see if find out if he's dead and see if I qualify for a pension? And the United States Pension Office solved more cold cases than any investigative agency in the history of the world, from finding all these dead husbands of widows. Of course, the first thing the pension office did was they would look and see if the soldier wasn't applying for a pension. And I saw one case where they wrote back and said, your husband did not die out west. Your husband is living 4 blocks from you in St. Louis.
Oh my goodness.
Here's his address. Uh,
Well,
but
you touched on Andersonville. Can we take that just one step further? What is the most valuable records? I mean, other than his military file that says he was in Andersonville, but if I wanted to actually get the Andersonville records, if they exist, where would I go?
okay, first off, the Andersonville records at the National Archives are on Ancestry. You can now that's the official ones, the ones that have been microfilmed. Now, I'm going to tell you about some important records here. If you had an ancestor who was a prisoner of war during the Civil War, an ancestor who was a prisoner of war. Now, these records are talked about in your handout under Union Civil War soldiers, also under Confederate Civil War soldiers. Okay, the War Department filled out a form that indexed all of its Civil War prisoner of war records on every soldier who was a prisoner of war, Union or Confederate. These records are at the National Archives. They have never been microfilmed. Now, these records were compiled with carbon paper. And so there's a copy filed alphabetically by your ancestor's name. Then there's a copy of the record that is filed by his regiment. So let's say you're writing a regimental history or something. You could have the cards pulled for the regiment and then go through the regiment and see how many of the boys in the regiment ended up at Andersonville, how many of them died there. Now, this is something even I have never done, but I want to do it for a particular case sometime in the future. But what you get is this index sheet, and the index sheet includes information on the prisoner of war. Often the information includes stuff that was not in his service record, particularly if he's a Union Civil War soldier. For whatever reason, they don't put it in the service record, but it's on this sheet, this index sheet, and it also gives you the book and page number that the information came from. Now, I'm researching this couple, and they were on a ship, and the ship ended up being captured by the Confederacy, and the couple ended up at Andersonville. It's a long, complicated story. Read my book, Ghosts and Shadows of Andersonville. But it's a sea captain and his wife, and the wife was pregnant, and she gave birth to the only baby born at Andersonville prison. A lot more to the story. Okay, the records, their prisoner of war records on microfilm and on Ancestry went so far. But then when I got these index sheets, there was a lot more information, very valuable information that was not on the records that have been microfilmed and scanned. My great goal, if I ever get back to Washington and I've got some time on my hand, is I want to take the actual books that are indexed on that sheet and pull them out and look at the records that were recorded there to see if there's even more information that they didn't put on the sheet that could mean something to me. Because there's still a lot of questions about how they ended up in Andersonville I never resolved. And I've been searching for years. Maybe there's something more. If I take it all the way to the rock bottom record, the earliest records the National Archives has got, not what's copied onto these sheets or copied onto the records that were microfilm, but the original record. I want to do that, even if I have to do it as an even if I have to do that as an experiment.
Well, that's great. That sounds wonderful. Let's see here. There's some comments in the chat box. Let's see here. Tracy says, can you repeat the name of the Pennsylvania resource that you like? Thank you.
Yes, that's the Pennsylvania Historical Society. It's at 100 Locust Street in Philadelphia. It is first rate and 5-star, and it is also the home of the Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. But the greatest thing about it is this wonderful, dirty old card catalog they've got. It's just priceless because there's all this information the staff put in these cards that's not recorded anywhere else. You know, they cross-reference their manuscripts and all these wonderful resources. Another good place to research, if you've got the time and the patience, is the archives of the city of Philadelphia. Very good. When I was there years ago, very nice staff, very helpful. It's just a mountain, but the records are mountainous and still need a lot of work. But that's the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, also called the Pennsylvania Historical Society. It's great for genealogical research, great for historical research, and it's at 100 Locust Street in Philadelphia. And be sure to check at their website. Also, I should mention this. If your ancestor was a craftsman in Philadelphia in, say, the days of Oliver Evans and Benjamin Franklin, way back when, be sure to send an email to the it's not the American Antiquarian, American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, which was founded by Benjamin Franklin. But they have you might find that your machinist or mechanic ancestor was a member and even knew Benjamin Franklin and Oliver Evans and some of these famous people. But anyway, you can contact them. In the South, we have something similar for Southern craftsmen and artisans. It's called the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts, MESDA, MESDA, Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. Okay, your ancestor had a saddlery shop in Philly. I would be sure. What would it hurt to send the American Philosophical Society email? They may have some record of him as a member, or might have some other kind of records of him. Pennsylvania research is an excellent representation of how every state is different. And if you're going to do a thorough job on any state, you need to learn the specific resources for a particular state. Randall has raised his hand, and as much as I keep trying to connect with him, I just don't seem to be able to do that.
Randall, go ahead.
I'm here. Earlier you gave the email address you had on some handouts, and I could not write it down. So I was wondering if
I'm sorry.
Get it again, or if it can go into the chat.
Sure, no problem. GENWS at HIWAAY.net. GENWS at HIWAAY.net. My genealogy library had my college's first email address. And when the college finally generally took in email, I just kept the original address for myself.
Thank you. I got it this time.
Okay,
Very
then
good.
there's another Randall in Clearwater, Florida. He mentioned in the chat, just a comment, the use of CT scans is the same process for the 1921 records of Ireland burn, just amazing tools. So I
Yes.
wanted to make sure he got that comment in. Now, I have another question. If you had to pick just one resource for each war, like let's say you were going to be on a desert island and there was only one book for each war that you could take with you or to save from destruction, what book for each war would it be?
Well, that would be that would be very difficult. For World War One, there was a 3-volume set of books done that had photographs and information on every World War One soldier who died, anyone who died in service during the First World War. And that's really the best source for that. Oh, I should mention there is a series of books, and this is available, mentioned in your handout. There's been a series of books done. They're encyclopedias for each of America's wars. And these have been published for each war. So if I were going to be stuck on a desert island, I would be stuck with, I would ask for the encyclopedia for each of these respective wars. They're usually 1-volume books. There's an encyclopedia of the war in Vietnam, an encyclopedia on the Korean conflict, encyclopedia of World War II, World War One. And these are valuable research tools because you're reading Grandpa's letters from the trenches in World War One, and he's saying things that have no meaning to you at all. But you go to the encyclopedia of World War One, and this is what he means. This is what he said. Years ago, I nearly made a terrible mistake in an article I was writing about this white German commander of a black regiment in Georgia. And this black soldier was complaining, saying that if the colonel didn't stop kicking them, the men were going to leave. I mean, the men were going to mutiny. And this was so out of character with their commander because he seemed like such a nice guy. Why is he kicking his soldiers? And then somebody pointed out to me, but fortunately, just in time, when it says he's kicking them, he's not physically assaulting them. He's throwing them out of the regiment. In other words, if you refuse to obey orders or you were not up to snuff, he was kicking you out of the regiment, not physically kicking you. And that's what the letter was about. He expected much from his soldiers, and some of them apparently were not up to snuff. Yes, Randall.
The books that you're referring to, are they what they call the military green books?
No, I don't know what the military green book is, so I can't. These were done by those these big fancy companies that do encyclopedias of everything in some form or fashion, and they did them for each of America's wars. I bought a set of them for Wallace State's collection. So, because people came in with questions about a particular military conflict, we could pull this out and they could read the reference to it. There's some outfit, ACLO, any of you librarians would know what I'm talking about. Because
ABCLIO.
Yes, they did the series of books, and they're first rate. And then, of course, the American Civil War has an encyclopedia for the Confederacy, which is several volumes, and a set of encyclopedia for the Civil War, more than one, that is also several volumes. In fact, I can't imagine anything on the American Civil War that doesn't have a reference book to it. Some more great questions.
I'll keep on going with my questions until somebody else pipes in. Go ahead, class. If you have a question, go ahead and ask. Okay, while I'm waiting for more questions to come in, earlier in the chat box, somebody had mentioned about your professional, the charges that you charge as a professional genealogist. I just kind of have a question. I know you worked at Wallace State for a long time, and you kind of mentioned your computer knowledge beforehand, but how did you eventually become a professional genealogist? I mean, what took you there?
Well, that's not really that complicated a story. I may have told you this story before, and if I have, I'm sorry I'm boring you with it again. But when I was a senior at North Georgia, my whole world fell apart. I essentially had no family, and I had no money, and I had no college degree, and the Army was not going to give me a commission. So I was sitting at this bar drinking my sorrows, and at the other end of the bar was the Greek goddess Clio. And she said, "Been in town long, sailor?" and she and I have been together ever since. Now, the story is exaggerated in some ways. For example, I'm a teetotaler. But I would never be in a bar drowning my sorrows. But anyway, Clio and I have been together. Anyway, while I was a cadet at North Georgia, I had been Georgia's first history intern. And I did a report on the possibility of making Kettle Creek, this is 1974, making Kettle Creek Battlefield a state park. And I'd done a lot of research at the Georgia Archives. And anyway, we were the country was at the bottom of a recession, and I have a hard time getting jobs anyway. And a member of the staff at the archive said, all these people keep asking us if they could pay us to do research for them, and we couldn't do the research for them even if they were paying it for us. Could we refer you to them?" And I said, "Sure." And that's when I became a professional genealogist. All these people saw me on the list and were paying me to do research at the Georgia Archives. It never paid very well, but I was doing pretty good, reasonably well, by the time that I got the job at Wallace State. I was a professional researcher for 14 years, during which time I went on to get a master's degree and to try to get jobs and all sorts of other things that didn't work out. I always ended up back at the Georgia Archives doing private research for people and writing books for the Southern Historical Press. Those 8 books you mentioned, most of them I did for the Southern Historical Press. Plus, I flew all over the country giving talks on Georgia research and things like that. Like I said, none of it paid very well. I lived on a cot in my grandmother's living room those years, but there are a lot worse jobs. I mean, and there are a lot worse jobs that pay a lot better. I'm not complaining or criticizing, but that's just me. But I have the kind of personality, it's like a good friend of mine said one time, he said, "I think the world of Bob. He's like a son to me." But could you imagine anybody ever hiring him? Um, I guess that's just my personality or something. But anyway, I was finally hired by somebody, and partly because of the fact he only had 3 minutes to talk to me, president of Wallace State. His daughter had just gone into labor and he had to rush to the hospital. So he said, "Do you want the job or not?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You're hired." And then he ran out the door. Uh,
Well,
and
that's our gain, because that's how I actually happened to meet you, was through your genealogy program at Wallace State. So I'm thankful for that. You had mentioned earlier something that really captivated my attention. You had mentioned that you had looked in one war records for somebody, and you found him in a different war record that you hadn't expected him to be in. And that kind of made me start thinking about a poster we have in our genealogy research room here at TMCC. And it lists the years of each war, beginning to end, and the age group of the soldiers that served during that war. And I got to thinking, it's really not that cut and dry, is it? I mean, you really have to think about bleeding over from one war into another as far as service is concerned. I mean, my own father would be a great example of that. My father fought in World War II, and then after he got out, he re-enlisted for Korea. So yes, I mean, you really do have to look if wars are close together in multiple places for those war records.
one of the most bizarre situations in that regard, and I've seen a lot of them. For example, when you visit the cyclorama of the Battle of Atlanta, now at the Atlanta History Center, they had a narrator who would explain that the average age of a Union Civil War soldier in the Battle of Atlanta was 17. I don't believe that for a moment, but I do believe they were young. I do believe they were young. But there was a project I'm working on. It's 20,000 acres of land in Georgia that was granted to the Comte d'Estaing for bringing his French Army and Navy to Georgia's aid during the Revolution. The Comte never saw the land, but the land ended up being owned by this family from Martinique in the Caribbean. And the people who owned the land, their son, as a child, the woman, the wife, had danced in the early had danced with Napoleon, who was a great admirer of her feat, and he was a personal friend of her little boy, her son. The little boy comes with them to Georgia and settles on the land. As a young man, as a teenager, he served as a lieutenant in the militia under Andrew Jackson at Horseshoe Bend. And he was a doctor in Athens, Georgia, and he served in all these military campaigns. And in 1861, when Georgia seceded from the Union, he was Major General of the Georgia militia in that part of Georgia. But what a military career. And then on top of all that, I used to play toy soldiers with Napoleon.
This is so interesting to me. I mean, and I think everybody here in the class, this is really a great lesson today. I'm just, every time you come to my class, I just learn so much. I'm just thrilled that we were able to get you today. So let me open up the platform here one more time to the class. Any questions?
I have one, Suzanne.
Go ahead, Paula.
Hi, Robert. Mick says hi, by the way, he's at work today. But I was gonna ask you, my fourth great grandfather over in Georgia, he was a War of 1812 veteran from Currituck County, North Carolina. He drew a pension, and his second wife, who was also indirectly related to me, she drew a pension after his death. He was also in those two books, I forgot the author, the two books of the Index to the Pensioners for the Indian Wars in Georgia. He's listed in that also. So I applied, I got the pension record for the War of 1812 before they were digitized and put on Fold 3. But at that time, I didn't order the Indian War. And so maybe in the last year, I tried to order the Indian War pension. I had the number and everything, and a widow. And I was told, or our National Archives, NAR, said that there was nothing in the file. Is that typical? If they drew a pension maybe for War of 1812, that there wouldn't be any records for the Indian War pension for the soldier or his widow?
Okay, well, the War of 1812 pension file, the Indian Wars pension file may have been merged into the War of 1812 file.
It wasn't in there. I have 75 pages from the War of 1812 pension, but there was nothing in there about his Indian service. And in the Georgia archives, the index cards they do have an index card, and it shows he was a lieutenant and promoted to captain, so which makes me, he served in, I believe it was the Creek Indian War in Georgia from Stewart County, or he was moving from Twiggs and then he was in Bibb, and then he was over in Stewart County after they pushed the creeks out. So would it have been more likely would it have been just state militia, even though it shows up?
Well, even if he was state militia, he still qualified for a War of 1812 pension. He still qualified for an Indian Wars pension. What I suspect is going on here is that they wrote to the last widow. Now, you got to understand, for the Indian Wars, you had to be as old as dirt to have gotten a pension, because it wasn't until like 1903 they were giving pensions for the Indian Wars. So his second widow may have applied for the pension, and they wrote back to her and said, well, we can't help you here because you're already drawing a pension on the War of 1812. You can't double dip.
Yeah, that's what
something
I
like
think. Yeah, because she died in
And-
1903 over in Alabama in Chilton County. And so
Yeah,
I
well,
think
that, yeah. Or what could have happened is she could have wrote to them, they wrote back and explained the situation, and she never responded, so they just trashed the file
yeah,
because
that
they,
might be possible, because she did draw the pension my fourth great grandmother was already deceased, and then she applied after he died in 1885. And so, but it was wonderful. What I found out, all the stuff I got in that record, he was only 14 and a half years old and 5'4.5". And he lived to be about his late 80, about almost 90 when he died in Randolph County, Georgia. And your books helped me immensely too, by the way.
Well, I've been getting into some trouble with some DAR members because some projects I'm working on. I referred to some of the Revolutionary War soldiers as boy soldiers and child soldiers and things like that. And of course, the term child soldier has ugly connotations to it. But in the frontier South during the American Revolution, I could see 11, 12, 13-year-old boys following their fathers in the war. I mean, maybe they didn't carry a musket or something. Maybe, they took care of the mules. But I mean, life was hard back then, and childhood was very brief. Um, for a book that I'm finishing the manuscript for, a Black Revolutionary War soldier named Austin Dabney was nursed back to health after being rescued by his white comrade from a battle. And the person who probably nursed Dabney back to health was a 5-year-old girl. Now, to you and me, that might sound outrageous, but when I checked on it, no, that was quite common. The little girls, if practically the little girls practically barely old enough to know how to walk, were given the responsibility of taking care of the sick and injured and wounded and things. And you're saying, well, how was that possible? Well, you have to understand they didn't have cots. You laid the wounded on a mattress of straw on the floor. So a 5-year-old would not have had any problem, bringing water and, whatever the wounded needed. And as crazy, as incredible as it sounds, anyway, she grows up and she and her husband take care of Austin Dabney, the wounded soldier, for the rest of his life. He was sort of crippled Revolutionary War pensioner, the only Black Revolutionary War pensioner we had before 1818. Anyway, she and her husband took care of him for years, and then their son took care of him until he died. But like I said, one of the many incredible things about this story is, like I say, she was probably only 5 years old when she was nursing this wounded Black soldier uh, back to health. And they apparently were friends for the rest of his life.
When do you expect that to be published?
That's segueing into a whole nother world. The way book publishing goes before this crazy world we lived in, if I had the manuscript ready to go right now and had been accepted by the publisher and everything, it would still probably be 2 years before I would be holding a finished copy in my hand. Well, now that's most publishers. There are some that work a lot faster, particularly if you're self-publishing. You can cut that back by many months. But this book, I think, is so important that I want to get a regular publishing company to publish it. I've got 2 other books that are being done that way, but I have a special publisher I want to publish it. I want the University of Georgia Press to publish it. If they say no, that's fine. I can find other publishers for it. But my biggest problem right now is finding the time. I've got a lot of obligations at the moment, including some publishing deadlines. I've got to sit down with this book and go back through it chapter by chapter, revising it, throwing out duplications, clarifying some things, and what have you. I started to do that, and then things just closed in on me responsibilities and such. And so I've had to put it aside. And I've still got 2 more weeks of working on articles before I can go back to the book again. I hope to have the manuscript ready for a publisher by Christmas. That may be too optimistic. And then the publisher is going to have to, if the publisher thinks it's worth considering, the publisher will then hire readers who will take 3 or 4 months to read it and send their remarks in. And then the publisher then has to decide, and the publication committee then has to decide if the book should be published. And usually it will be published, but only if some significant changes are made. And then when the changes are made and everybody agrees to it, then it's put in line to be published, which can easily be another year.
Oh my.
It's somebody one time compared it to a pregnant elephant in how long the whole process takes. It starts with a lot of noise and great hopes, and then takes 2 years or something before you get a result
My gosh, okay.
after a lot of pain and suffering.
Well, we
Um,
certainly appreciate,
It's
your
very
time
different from
today.
self-publishing, though. You what, ma'am?
Oh, I said, we certainly appreciate your time today. I mean, I realize you have a very busy schedule.
Well, I'm just sorry that I wasn't able to be with y'all last week. I intended to, but like I say, things get crazy, and when I wanted to be here with y'all, I was in the middle of Coleman getting groceries.
Understood. Okay, well, I'll give one more opportunity to the class. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you. Any last questions to our guest speaker? Okay, well, Robert, it looks like every question that they had has been answered. So we so appreciate your generous opportunity that you gave us today to share your expertise with us. And once again, it's greatly appreciated.
You're most welcome.
And thank you for allowing us to record. That's always greatly appreciated as well.
Thank you.
All right. So I'll open it up to the class. If you want to stay for the second half of class, please do. If you're going to leave us right now, if there's anything in the chat box that you want, grab it before you leave, because if you log back in, the chat box will be empty. So with that, I'll go ahead and just give it a few moments to see who's going to stay for the second half of class, and I'll stop the recording.